Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive where we like to take fascinating ideas and pull them apart and see what's really in there.
Yeah.
See what we can learn. And today we're going to be looking at something pretty fundamental. I think it's safe to say how we react when we're faced with new information.
Yeah.
Especially if that new information is something that challenges us or goes against what we think we already know.
Right.
And we're going to explore that.
Yeah.
By looking at some pretty old texts.
Okay.
And we're going to be pulling from a few different places. We're going to be in Songs. We're going to be in the Old Testament book of Jeremiah.
Right.
And in the Gospel of John.
Okay. Interesting combination.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it.
And, you know, our listeners are here because they want to understand things deeply, but they also want to understand things efficiently. And that's our mission today, too.
Right.
We're going to try to figure out why people see the same information, react in totally different ways.
Yeah.
And what role does open-mindedness play in all of this?
It's a question that's plagued thinkers and theologians and philosophers for centuries.
Yeah.
Why is it that one person can look at something and say, I get it. I'm going to change my view. And another person looks at the same thing and says, no way, no how.
Right. And we're going to see if these ancient texts can give us some insight to what's going on there.
That's the hope.
So why don't we jump right in to the Gospel of John?
Let's do it.
We find a really interesting situation in John chapter 7 where Jesus is speaking and people are already divided.
Right away.
Yeah, they are immediately split.
Yeah.
Some are saying this is definitely the prophet. Others are convinced he's the Christ.
The Messiah.
The Messiah.
Yeah.
But then there's a third group that's like, wait a second.
Hold on.
This doesn't make sense. The Messiah, the Christ is supposed to come from Bethlehem.
Right.
He's supposed to be a descendant of David. And this guy's from Galilee.
Yeah. Where's the lineage?
So what's interesting here is that the initial division isn't about the core of what Jesus is saying.
Right.
It's about how they are interpreting scripture and their preconceived notions of who the Messiah should be and where he should be from.
And you can almost see them looking at each other like, are you reading the same thing I'm reading?
It's like they have this image in their mind.
Yeah.
And if the reality doesn't fit in that box perfectly, it's rejected.
It can't be true.
And I think all of us have probably experienced that to some degree. Like we have an idea in our minds of how something is supposed to be.
Yeah.
And then reality doesn't match that.
Doesn't fit the mold.
And we experience this cognitive dissonance.
Absolutely.
And the thing is, they're all looking at the same source material.
Yeah.
But it's the lens through which they're viewing it.
That's it.
That's creating this huge difference.
Yeah.
Now the division gets even more intense.
Okay.
When the chief priests and the Pharisees get involved.
Oh, yeah.
So their officers come back from hearing Jesus speak.
Right.
And they are impressed. They're like, wow, this guy, no one's ever spoken like this.
Right.
But how do the chief priests and the Pharisees respond?
Well, like you'd expect, I guess.
They are dismissive.
Yeah.
Like completely dismissive. They're like, have any of the rulers or the Pharisees believed in him?
Right.
No.
So clearly he's a fraud.
But this mob,
This rabble.
who know nothing of the law,
Right.
they're cursed.
Yeah. How could they possibly understand?
So there's this element of authority bias.
Totally.
That's coming into play here.
Yeah.
Where because we are the experts,
Right.
we are the ones who are in charge. If we don't buy it,
then it's not worth considering.
it's not true.
And anybody who does buy it is ignorant.
Yeah, you see this in all different areas of life.
Yeah.
All throughout history. And it's really dangerous
Absolutely.
because it can prevent progress. It can prevent us from seeing the truth.
Yeah, and you think about science, right? Like the number of times where someone has had a groundbreaking idea and the established experts, the authorities have completely shot them down.
And they're like, you're crazy.
You're a crackpot.
Yeah, that's nonsense.
And sometimes those people have ended up being right.
Totally.
But thankfully, there's another character in this story, Nicodemus, who is a Pharisee.
Right.
But he comes in with a voice of reason.
With a different perspective.
Yeah.
Goodness.
He asks, does our law condemn a man
Right.
without first hearing him?
to find out what he's been doing.
What he's all about.
Yeah, and this just seems like common sense.
Like basic fairness.
The basic fairness.
Due process.
Yeah, but he actually has to say it.
He does.
Which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
But for our listeners who are here, because they want to have all the facts before they make a judgment.
Absolutely.
This is so important.
It is.
Like, we have to listen and understand before we just jump to a conclusion.
Yeah. Don't form an opinion before you have all the facts.
Right.
And even if you think you have all the facts, there might be something you're missing.
And I think that's what Nicodemus is pointing out here.
He is.
It's like, hey, let's just like hear the guy out before we condemn him.
Give you a chance.
Yeah. And I love that because that takes humility.
Totally.
To be able to do that. But how do they respond to this very reasonable point that he makes?
They don't like it.
They don't?
No.
They just double down on their prejudice.
I see.
They're like, are you also from Galilee?
Right.
Look into it.
Yeah.
And you will find that no prophet comes from Galilee. So they're not engaging with his point about due process.
They're just trying to discredit him.
They are just reinforcing their bias about Jesus based on where he's from.
Right.
Which is crazy.
Yeah, you can almost see Nicodemus's face just like palm to the face.
And this is where prejudice comes in.
Yes.
Because prejudice is a prejudgment. It's when we form an opinion based on incomplete information.
Or no information.
Or no information, yeah.
Just assumptions.
Or assumptions.
Yeah.
And this ties back to a reflection that we had in one of our source texts, which says, many were divided about Jesus, not because of his message, but because of their own hearts.
Their own internal stuff.
Prejudice and pride blinded them from recognizing the truth.
Which was right in front of them.
Which was right in front of them.
So close and yet so far.
Yeah, so it wasn't a logical assessment of what he was saying or doing.
Right.
It was that their biases prevented them from even considering the possibility.
Right, they weren't even open to the idea.
That he might be who he claimed to be.
And that's the thing about prejudice. It acts like a filter. So distorting that you can't even see straight.
Yeah, it blocks out the light.
It does.
And then you add pride on top of that. And pride makes us so unwilling to admit that we might be wrong.
Yeah, we all want to be right.
Or that we might not have the full picture. And that is a dangerous combination.
It was a recipe for disaster.
Because we just shut out truth.
Yeah.
And we cling to what we think we know.
And then you get confirmation bias, where you're only looking for information that already supports what you think.
You're just looking for evidence that confirms what you believe.
Yeah.
And anything that contradicts.
You just reject.
You just push it aside.
Yeah.
So the Pharisees were so convinced that the Messiah couldn't possibly come from Galilee.
Right.
That they didn't even entertain the idea.
Yeah.
That anything that Jesus said or did could be evidence to the contrary.
Right.
And this leads us to Psalm 119, verse 130.
Okay.
The unfolding of your words gives light. It gives understanding to the simple.
To the simple, yeah.
And there's this idea that understanding isn't necessarily about intellectual complexity.
Years of study.
Yeah. It's about an open heart.
An open mind.
An open mind.
Yeah.
It's about a willingness to receive the message.
The information.
Yeah. And I think the word simple here is really interesting.
It is.
Because it's contrasted with the Pharisees, who are the experts.
Right. They're the ones who know the law.
They know the law, but they're not open to a new understanding.
They think they already have it.
They think they have it all figured out.
Right.
So the simple are the ones who are humble enough to realize that they don't have all the answers. And so they're open to receiving new light.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's not about how much you know sometimes. It's about how much you're willing to let go of.
To empty your cup, so to speak.
Yeah.
To be filled with something new.
And this leads to the prayer.
Okay.
Lord, help me to receive your truth with humility and a willing heart.
And a willing heart.
Free me from pride and assumptions.
Those are the things
that keep me from hearing your voice.
That's the real problem.
And I think this gets to the heart of the matter.
It does.
It's recognizing that we have these internal barriers.
Yeah.
pride, assumptions, prejudices.
And they're blocking us.
And they can block us from recognizing the truth. And so this prayer is a request to be able to set those things aside.
To clear the path.
So that we can truly listen.
Right.
And I think this is a good point to ask our listeners. What assumptions do you need to surrender today so you can truly listen?
Because it's so easy to go through life just looking for things that support what we already think.
Yeah.
But that doesn't help us grow.
It doesn't.
It doesn't help us learn.
No, it keeps us stuck.
It keeps us stagnant.
Yeah.
And it can even prevent us from seeing really important truths.
No. Let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
And look at Jeremiah chapter 11.
Oh, yeah.
We see the prophet Jeremiah experiencing some pretty intense opposition. He says, the Lord made it known to me and I knew. Then you showed me their evil deeds.
Okay.
But I was like, gentle lamb led to the slaughter.
Oh, wow.
I did not know it was against me.
Yeah.
They devised schemes.
So he feels totally betrayed.
Yeah, he feels like he's being targeted because he's speaking the truth.
Yeah.
And this is something that I think we can all relate to some degree.
On some level.
That feeling when you share something that you believe to be true and you're met with resistance, with hostility,
with anger, with pushback.
It's a really tough experience.
It can make you feel like you're all alone.
Yeah, like, what am I doing?
It's crazy. And it's interesting because we saw how the crowd reacted to Jesus, and now we're seeing how someone delivering a message is affected by that.
Right. Personally. And it's interesting how Jeremiah responds. He cries out to the Lord of hosts, who judge righteously, who tests the heart.
The heart and the mind.
And the mind.
Yeah.
And he asks for justice.
Right.
Because he's committed his cause to God.
To a higher power.
Yeah. And this is this element of trusting that ultimately there is a higher power.
A judge? A righteous judge?
A righteous judge that will vindicate the truth.
That's ultimately where the hope lies.
Yeah.
That even if people misunderstand you, even if they reject what you're saying, ultimately there's a higher truth.
And we see this in Psalms as well.
We do.
In Psalm 7, verses 2 and 3, David pleads for rescue from those who might rend me like a lion. Again, that sense of being threatened for speaking truth, for doing what's right.
Yeah. And then in Psalm 7, verses 9 through 12, he prays for the end of the wicked.
Right.
And the establishment of the righteous. Yeah. Trusting that God is the righteous judge.
The righteous.
Who tests the minds and hearts. So we see this theme throughout all of these texts. Yeah. This idea that when we face opposition, when we're speaking truth.
Or what we believe to be true.
Yeah. We can find comfort in knowing that ultimately there is a righteous judge who will make things right.
It's a very comforting thought.
It is. Yeah. So when we tie all of these threads together from the Gospel of John, from Jeremiah, and from Psalms.
What do we see?
It emerges.
What emerges?
Yeah.
I think the thing that really stands out to me is this idea that division arises, not just from the information itself.
Not just from the facts. Yeah. The data.
But from the internal state.
The internal state.
Of the people receiving that information.
Right.
Our preconceived notions.
Yeah.
Our pride.
Prejudices.
Our prejudices.
Our biases.
Our bias.
All of that internal stuff.
That resistance to being challenged. Yeah. All of that prevents us from truly understanding.
From seeing clearly.
And it can even lead us to react negatively.
Totally.
To those who are presenting new ideas or challenging ideas. And that brings us to the other side of the coin.
Okay, the opposite.
The alternative.
The antidote.
Yeah, humility, open-mindedness, willingness to listen.
To learn.
Even when it's difficult.
Even when it's challenging.
Yeah.
Even when it makes us uncomfortable.
Right.
These texts are saying that true understanding isn't just about accumulating more information.
It's not just about facts and figures. Yeah. It's about the posture of your mind.
Yeah.
The attitude you bring to it.
That's
cultivating a heart
and a mind.
That are receptive to truth.
Wherever it may come from.
Yeah. Even if it's
from someone you don't like.
Even if it's from someone that you disagree with. It's about being willing to set aside our biases.
Or prejudices.
Yeah. Even when they're deeply ingrained.
Even when it's hard.
So we can truly see and hear something new.
That's the key.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, let me leave you with this.
Okay.
What assumptions or prejudices are influencing how you see things today? How are they affecting the way you interpret new information? What might shift if you were to approach things with a truly open and humble heart?
That's the question.
And we're going to leave it there.
All right.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.